And I'm going to give you a minute to log on from the waiting room. And in the meantime, I'll get the closed captions up and running. So when those are up, you should see a red live button at the top of your screen. And you can click on that and follow along with the closed captions in a separate window. All right, those should be up and running. Well, welcome everyone. So glad you could join us today for a Pride Month webinar. Simone and I always like to squeeze it in at the end of Pride Month. We made it just under the wire. So many of you already know Simone Chris. She is the Director of Transgender Rights Initiative at Southern Legal Counsel. She is always doing trainings and outreach and really trying to spread the word about how to better represent LGBTQ people in general, and especially LGBTQ youth. So that's what she'll be talking to us about today. Thank you to the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar for co-sponsoring this webinar and for helping us get our CLEs approved. I will announce that at the end. And as you can see, it is being recorded, so I'll send the recording out tomorrow, and Simone has agreed to share her PowerPoint with everyone, as well as some additional resources. So those will go out tomorrow from Zoom. And without further ado, I will pass this over to Simone.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. As she said, I'm Simone Chris. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the director of Southern Legal Counsel's Transgender Rights Initiative. And I'm just really excited to be back doing this again. I don't know who maybe had attended last year's 2020 Pride Month LGBTQ best practices webinar, but I appreciate those of you who are back for more. I tried to really focus this year on the impacts of everything that's kind of happened in the last year and a half, and the impacts of COVID on, education, as well as just general mental health of the kids who we represent. I have the honor of working with trans youth every day, representing them in education issues statewide, assisting families with navigating the name and gender marker change processes in Florida and elsewhere if the child's birth certificate is from a different state, doing impact litigation to obtain access to equal health care for trans folks who in Florida are often denied access to gender affirming care, all sorts of good stuff. So the information that I'm going to discuss with you all today comes from lots of research and reviewing all the recent studies on the disparities that LGBTQ kids face, but also my daily interactions with the trans youth in this state who are being impacted by all these said things. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. All right, can everybody see that?
Looks great.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. So today we are going to talk about, kind of just the changes since we all were here last year. For those of you who were here, we're going to do a little refresher on LGBTQ cultural competency. I'm not going to go crazy in depth with that like I usually do, only because I think a lot of people have attended one of these presentations I've done. And there's just so much material to cover. And then we're going to talk about the legal framework for representing trans youth, particularly in education settings, and the legal rights and the legal needs of trans students. And then we're going to talk through some practical application best practices for representing these kids. All right, so I think it's important that we remember, we've all been destabilized in any number of ways over the past year and a half. And that destabilization also impacts these youth, particularly vulnerable youth who may have been disproportionately impacted economically, disproportionately impacted educationally, disproportionately impacted in that they belong to a vulnerable community or a minority group that has been targeted, such as LGBTQ youth and Asian Americans since the pandemic. So let's just quickly run through what's new. So, coronavirus, global pandemic. Of course, it shut down schools. This was huge for all of our students going to online learning, and we're going to go through all the ways that that impacted marginalized, vulnerable youth. I only have this in here because and you guys aren't going to be able to respond because we're on Zoom, but my wife acted like this was like the big scary thing that was going on at one point. But then I never heard anything else about it. So I don't know if murder hornets were real. If you had an experience with murder hornets, please message me and let me know because I'm interested. There were wildfires. RBG passed, which was devastating. There was an attack on the Capitol, which sends all sorts of messages to vulnerable youth. 2021, we are killing it. This is officially the worst year in recent history for anti-LGBTQ legislative attacks. And Florida is no exception. On the very first day of Pride Month, as a happy Pride, Governor DeSantis signed into law the Transgender Sports Ban that bans transgender girls from participating in sports in accordance with their gender identity. So that was not a great start to Pride, I will say. I will just give a quick note right now that if anybody on this webinar is working with or knows any transgender female athletes who will be impacted by this ban, please reach out to me. We are working on a challenge, and it would be great to be in touch with more trans female athletes. And then of course, now we're working on overcoming the learning losses as a result of COVID. And so today I want to talk a lot about what we can be doing to make sure that when these youth are reintegrated back into school, if they didn't already return to online learning, or if they continue virtual learning, that they have the services and supports and accommodations in place to be able to be successful. All right. Okay, so I just gave you so much bad news, but some good things have happened in the last year also. So, an executive order preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation, which came from the Supreme Court's very clear message in Bostock last year, which we touched on briefly. I think it had come out like within days of the presentation I did last year, which said that, under Title VII, the federal employment law, discrimination on the basis of sex includes discrimination on the basis of transgender status and sexual orientation. That was then applied right here in the 11th Circuit to Title IX, which precludes sex discrimination in schools. And so the Drew Adams case set the precedent that, the same definition of sex discrimination applies to kids in school. So we can't discriminate against LGBTQ youth under Title IX. Yesterday, and I just added this, but yesterday the Supreme Court denied cert on the Gavin Brim case, which for those of you who don't know, this poor kid has been fighting for 7 years for access to the male bathroom at his school that he has not attended in like 4 years at this point. He's 22 years old. He's been out of high school for a while. And this case was brought originally in the Fourth Circuit when he was a freshman in high school. And so now there's finally an end to that saga, which is just a huge victory for trans students everywhere that we needed right now. The Department of Education and the Department of Justice put out guidance. There was all this, last year I was trying to go through so the Obama administration put out this guidance saying that Title IX protects on the basis of gender identity and expression. And then the Trump administration rescinded that guidance. What does that mean? What does it not mean? Now, luckily, this guidance doesn't really matter because we have a very clear statement from the courts that Title IX protects LGBTQ youth. However, it's wonderful when we have, good guidance from the top, and it sends a really clear message to transgender and LGBTQ youth that they are valued, they are equal. So the DOE notice of interpretation on Title IX in light of the Bostock opinion was very helpful. All right, so before we dive into some of the disparities and the impacts of COVID, we're going to get to cultural competency later, but I just wanted to do a quick overview for individuals who may not have attended my training before or an LGBTQ training before and have no idea what I'm talking about in these coming slides. So just real quick, the gender red person helps to describe the differences between sexual orientation and gender identity and to explain what transgender actually means. So your biological sex is the sex that you are assigned at birth, and it is pretty much a determination by a doctor based on external genitalia, where, you know, a penis means they put M and a vagina means they put F on your birth certificate, and that's your sex assigned at birth. What that doesn't take into account are all of the other components of what make up a person's sex, which includes hormones, chromosome levels, gender identity, etc. And so your gender identity, which is up here, is who you know yourself to be. And when people are like, how could a kid know they're trans? I always ask, well, when did you know that you were cis? So cisgender means your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity are aligned. Most people don't make these conscious decisions at 2 or 4 or 8 that I'm a boy. They just know. Same with trans kids and trans people. Your gender identity tells you, is your sense of being a man, a woman, or neither. And that's something that you don't know until you ask someone. So if I were to ask you all what you think my gender identity was, chances are you'd probably say female. And you would be making an assumption about my gender identity based on my gender expression, the long hair, the earrings, the, you know, can't really tell, but it's a fitted suit-ish. There are things that I'm expressing to you that might convey to you that I identify as female based on the way I'm expressing myself. However, any of you who have met me outside of work know that my gender expression is not consistently feminine. I present much more masculinely, and my gender expression is much more masculine outside of work. So gender expression can vary, and it doesn't mean a person is transgender just because their gender expression might vary. And then, so my sex assigned at birth is female, my gender identity is female, and my gender expression, you know, varies, but right now it's pretty feminine. But that tells you absolutely nothing about my sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is who you are attracted to, has absolutely nothing to do with your gender. There are, you know, I am a cisgender woman, meaning my gender identity and my sex assigned at birth align, they're both female. But my sexual orientation is lesbian. I'm attracted to other women. I am married to a woman. And so it's just important that we all understand that these are separate and distinct concepts, and we don't conflate them, because we say LGBTQ. I'm going to say LGBTQ a lot throughout this. But sexual orientation and gender identity and expression are totally separate things. If you have questions, let me know. So like I said before, you know, a person's sex is multifaceted and is made up of many different things, not just their external genitalia. Everyone has a gender identity. Like I said, y'all probably don't remember when you decided that yours was consistent with your sex assigned at birth, and most trans people didn't make a decision that their gender identity wasn't consistent with their sex assigned at birth. You just know. It's a fundamental component of your identity, and it can't be changed by social or medical intervention. What you can do is try to bring your body, your physical characteristics, into alignment with your gender identity, but you cannot change a person's gender identity. It has been shown that conversion therapy is absolutely unsuccessful, first of all, but also unbelievably detrimental, and I believe is a form of abuse. Conversion therapy is trying to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. All right, we talked about that. All right, so like I said, a transgender person is someone who has a gender identity that doesn't match their sex assigned at birth. It's an umbrella term. Some people are non-binary. These folks often use they, them pronouns, and that means that, you know, they don't feel they fit into one of these two boxes that we've decided all people in our society have to fit into. And the boxes, male and female, are associated with all of these stereotypical assumptions about how you should look, how you should dress, how you should, you know, what jobs you should have, whether you should be interested in trucks or dolls, whether you should like blue or pink. There's all these just societal expectations. And some people just don't feel that they fit into one of those boxes. So some of those people identify as non-binary. And then gender non-conforming, sometimes transgender people identify as gender non-conforming. Sometimes it has nothing to do with your gender identity. You know, I might be deemed gender non-conforming because I wear clothing that's from the male section of the store in most areas of my life. But that doesn't mean I'm trans. I just don't conform to stereotypical gender roles and notions. So, all right, now that we've gotten those key terms down, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on kind of everyone, and then specifically on the LGBTQ community. So before the pandemic, these are pre-pandemic disparities. We knew that 90% of trans folks experience employment discrimination, a third live in poverty, 3 times the national average are unemployed, a third experience homelessness, and nearly 40% of our homeless youth in the whole country identify as LGBTQ. We know this is because LGBTQ kids are more likely to be kicked out. They are more likely to lack family support. They are more likely to experience abuse and domestic violence in the home, more likely to end up leaving the foster care system because of how sex segregated and gendered the system is. And then the suicide rate, the attempted suicide rate among the trans community is 9 times the national average. And this has been, all of these have been exacerbated by COVID, obviously, but this is all like pre-pandemic. And actually, I found this really interesting. HUD point in time count data, which HUD is, over the homeless and housing services. Between 2016 and 2019, the number of homeless transgender individuals increased 88%. So clearly, before COVID even hit, we had a national crisis on our hands when it comes to trans individuals. And I'm hoping that while the national conversations targeting trans individuals, there were over 250 anti-LGBTQ bills passed or introduced this year, this legislative session, and that led, discussion on the national stage about trans rights to the forefront. And while a lot of that conversation has been really, really negative and really harmful, I do think that it has resulted in people actually talking about these disparities and us having to look at them and really address them. And I'm hoping that everyone on this webinar walks away with a sense of desire to help, address these disparities for LGBTQ and particularly trans youth. All right, so a study from 2020, which looked at data from 2019, so right before the pandemic, showed that over 50% of trans and non-binary youth had seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months. Over 60% of trans and non-binary youth engaged in self-harm in the past 12 months. Over 75% experienced generalized anxiety disorder, and over 60% had been prevented or discouraged from using a bathroom corresponding with their gender identity, which is a huge issue in keeping kids, in pushing kids out of school, because I can't imagine having to hold my bladder all day long at work. In school is, even more like this period and this period and this period. It's very structured and rigid, and having to, just avoid using the bathroom. So many of the kids that I work with would just not consume liquid or food during the day so that they didn't have to use the bathroom. And that, is not a sustainable way to get through school. And so many of these kids were pushed out as a result of non-affirming policies like, bathroom policies. All right, pre-pandemic, 50% of trans youth were not able to use the name and pronouns that match their gender markers. So just real quick, when people are transgender, oftentimes they were given a name at birth that some people refer to as their dead name. And that's not the name that they use. That name is associated with a person that they don't see when they look in the mirror. They have a name that matches their gender identity, and that's called their affirmed name. And we're going to go through the legality of all this later, but students, even in the absence of a legal name change, should have their affirmed name and their affirmed pronouns. So pronouns are she, her, he, him, they, them, whatever. Affirmed pronouns means the pronouns associated with your gender identity, not your sex assigned at birth. So students people should be using students' affirmed name and pronouns at school, even if they haven't gone through a legal transition and updated their documents. We're going to go through a little bit later a really creative way that I found to update trans youth's information in the student information systems like Focus, Skyward, et cetera, so that they aren't outed every day when their dead name is read out, on a class roster, or it appears on a virtual learning platform, whatever. 60% of these students were forced to use a bathroom or locker that didn't match their gender identity. 70% avoided bathrooms because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. 75% felt unsafe at school. So when these kids feel unsafe at school, we can all probably guess that results in school aversion, not going, falling behind academically, not participating in the things that allow for social and emotional growth and development. If you feel unsafe at school, you're probably not going to be joining clubs and teams and engaging in all the things that kind of make school fun and allow for, social emotional development and friendships to be built and all that good stuff. So trans students who experience higher levels of victimization are 3 times as likely to have missed school, and 40% had attempted suicide in their lifetime, which again is 9 times the average. So homelessness, this great new survey came out from Schoolhouse Connection that analyzed this data from 27 states from their youth risk behavior surveys. And it showed that simply identifying as LGBTQ is a indicator, like it makes you much more likely to become homeless. So of all the high school students that they looked at and analyzed, 28.7% of the LGBTQ high school students were experiencing homelessness, which is almost twice the rate of heterosexual students. They were 9.22 times more likely to experience homelessness than their cisgender peers. And again, cisgender means not transgender. And this is important because this is actually the first time that there was enough, this CDC risk behavior survey has been being conducted since I think 1990. And this was the first time they'd ever collected enough data about trans youth to actually provide a statistic on this regarding high school students. So I thought that was really interesting. And then more than 1 in 3 students experiencing homelessness attempt suicide in the year prior to the survey. So when you add the compounding effects of being LGBTQ, being trans, and those suicide statistics, and then the statistics around being homeless and attempted suicide, and those converge, you can understand that these youth are in a really, really difficult situation in terms of mental health. All right, so one of the things that made the impact of COVID so much more devastating for communities of color and the transgender community, and then again, when those two things converge, when you are a transgender person and also a person of color, one of the things that made COVID hit this community so disproportionately hard is these folks are much less likely to have access to healthcare. So 22% of trans people don't have healthcare, and 34% of trans people of color had no healthcare. So this, once you get sick, any of the things that you need access to healthcare for, it made it really difficult for these folks to get care during the pandemic. Even those who do have health insurance, if you live in a rural area or just in an area where there aren't gender affirming medical providers, that's basically the same as not having access to gender affirming care. If your doctor does not know how to treat you and your unique needs and provide gender affirming care to treat your gender dysphoria. And then even among those who do have health insurance, a lot of health insurance plans have discriminatory exclusions. I don't know if folks are familiar with the lawsuit that we have right now at the Northern District. It's at summary judgment, but we sued the state of Florida for providing discriminatory health insurance to all state employees in the state of Florida. So anyone who is a state of Florida employee has a healthcare plan that has a categorical exclusion for gender affirming care. So this means they can't, get the care that is medically necessary and recommended by their doctor because it's categorically excluded by their health insurance plans. So it's like, they don't have health insurance. And then even when they do, there's sometimes no doctors they can see. And then even when there's doctors they can see, they're denied because of these exclusions. So it's just really difficult for this community. Trans individuals are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with HIV. 1/3 have had a negative experience seeking healthcare, including verbal harassment, refusal of treatment. And this one is really interesting, needing to teach the healthcare provider about transgender people and their needs in order to receive care. And one of the contributing factors to this is medical schools are, for the large part, failing to prepare med students to meet the needs of the LGBTQ community. One study showed that there's an average of 5 hours in all of med school spent on learning about the unique needs of LGBTQ individuals and LGBTQ health. So the lack of inclusive medical education contributes to these health disparities and these really negative outcomes. And I could go on forever about this on my soapbox, but we need to make sure that in the medical profession, like in the legal profession, like we're all working on right now, we are actively working on combating implicit and explicit biases, because within the medical profession, it is, there's just a huge lack of understanding about the needs of this community. 28% of trans individuals have not gone to the doctor when they needed to, when they had an actual medical issue, medical need, because they feared mistreatment. So all of this, you know, sets trans folks up to be hit really hard by things like a global pandemic. All right, so COVID's impact on students. So obviously there are deepened divides in educational opportunity. The early data, so what's tough with this is there isn't a whole lot of concrete data out there yet about educational disparities and the impact on youth, because these teachers and schools and districts have been so, you know, focused on just getting through and doing the virtual education and just trying to cope and get through all of this, that there hasn't been as much reporting and data and statistics and all that like there has been, you know, economically and in other areas outside of education. But early data and studies suggest that there were, you know, drops in coursework completed, increased dispersion of test scores, and less time spent on schoolwork and studying. And it really widened we all know, like, it's not like the pandemic caused educational gaps and disparities. We all work with, you know, vulnerable populations in Florida and understand that there are so many education disparities and gaps that already exist in this state, but it widened them, disproportionately impacting students who already had the greatest education needs and the fewest opportunities, such as students from historically marginalized and underserved groups, LGBTQ youth, students of color, English language learners, students from low-income families, and students with disabilities. All right, so barriers to learning during COVID. I think this kind of goes without saying, for kids that didn't have access to internet, that didn't have a laptop with a webcam, that didn't, you know, have family support or structure at home, or whose, you know, parents were working multiple jobs just trying to make ends meet and weren't there to help navigate online things. It was really difficult to stay engaged and even access virtual classrooms for many of our most vulnerable youth. Many, you know, parents and families lost jobs, lost income, had, you know, deaths in the family, et cetera, that created a really difficult home environment. For many of these kids, you know, the kids from vulnerable communities statistically are more likely to receive their only services and support. So like mental health support or behavioral services or, you know, academic supports, whatever it may be, at school. And so this kind of cut so many kids off from the only place where they're receiving that type of care. Rural and high poverty school districts had difficulty maintaining the one-on-one contact and regular check-ins with students in a virtual setting. The impact of on students with disabilities was really significant because, like, you know, I said, aids and services that are needed to support their academic progress and prevent regression were, you know, just not, there's just so many things that couldn't happen in a virtual learning environment. And so one study showed that instruction that students were receiving for those who could access it and, you know, were able to engage wasn't designed to teach new skills and understanding, but rather to kind of review and maintain what had already been taught, which was referred to as a pandemic holding pattern, like, let's just not regress. So, you know, data shows learning losses they're up to 60% larger though for students from less educated homes, which, you know, just further confirms our concerns about the uneven toll of the pandemic on vulnerable children. And a lot of the achievement losses that I've seen so far in the data seem to be with math. There's been less regression with reading and more with math. But again, you know, these are early studies and data analyses, and hopefully more of this will continue to come out. Oh, sorry, I got this new clicker and I'm still learning how to use it. All right, so, you know, challenges to mental health and well-being, obviously, lack of access to school-based services and supports, feelings of isolation, lack of family support, rises in domestic violence, loss of loved ones due to to the virus, economic instability, all of these things exacerbated, particularly for vulnerable communities and trans kids who are already disproportionately likely to experience depression, anxiety, psychological distress, and suicidal ideation as a result of their gender dysphoria, being stuck, sometimes in an unaffirming, non-affirming environment, maybe with family where you're not out or you don't feel affirmed. It just, all of this exacerbated all of the issues that these kids already were experiencing. We all lived through the last couple of years and know that the messages that our Black and brown kids, our kids from communities of color, our LGBTQ kids, we know the messages they've been receiving because we've been receiving them as well. And, it's led to obviously stigmatization and feelings of discrimination and inferiority, but there's also been an increase in identity-based harassment and violence and hateful rhetoric, which has just been devastating for targeted students, including, students of color, transgender youth, Asian Americans, etc. All right, so when we're looking specifically at LGBTQ youth, a recent study showed that 48% of LGBTQ youth who wanted or needed mental health care in 2020 were unable to access it. The shutting down of non-essential services and non-emergency medical procedures really took a toll on the trans community because, most gender affirming care would not fall into the category, not my category, our category, but the category of emergency medical services. Yet for so many of these kids, access to their mental health provider, access to blockers, puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or whatever are life-saving and critical. And many folks were cut off from access to the care that they needed. 85% of trans and non-binary youth reported that COVID-19 negatively impacted their mental health. This is much higher than the statistics of the cisgender heterosexual population. 78% reported that throughout the pandemic, their mental health was poor on a scale of like poor to good, either most of the time or always during COVID-19. And again, this is in large part due to being cut off from, for some trans youth, the place where they feel affirmed and have, a community within which they feel welcome and secure and safe and all that is, at school or at their support group. There's LGBTQ support groups, PFLAGs, things like that. And so being cut off from those was really devastating for these kids. Like I said, so, the things like LGBTQ student alliances, GSAs, supportive teachers or coaches, counselors, they serve as buffers to protect LGBTQ youth against the mental health burden due to social isolation and psychological trauma. And so quarantine and social distancing made that really difficult. And again, increased time at home did increase the risks of isolation and abuse from unsupportive or actively hostile family members, inability to express students' sexual orientation or gender identity. 50% of LGB youth, which means, LGBTQ relates to sexual orientation and trans and non-binary relate to gender identity, but 50% and 65% respectively of these youth were not able to be who they were for, this really extended period of time while stuck at home. One other thing that I wanted to mention is for trans youth, this is something I experienced at the very beginning of the pandemic. There are students who I had worked with to make sure, and who others had worked with, who had somehow been able to have the teachers and staff identify them using their affirmed name and pronouns. Like at school, they were called the correct name, they were called the correct pronouns, it wasn't an issue. But they hadn't completed a legal name change or gender marker change or updated their birth certificate. So in the system, it still showed the dead name and the old gender marker. And so when we first moved into virtual learning, there were so many kids who, when they saw the virtual learning platform say their dead name, many of whom their peers didn't know, they had been living in accordance with their gender identity for, a significant period of time. And most people didn't know that they were trans, and seeing that dead name outed these kids to their peers. And so many trans students would preferred not to engage, not to log on, not to, be outed every day, rather than deal with the cyberbullying and psychological distress and depression and all of that can be caused by, seeing their dead name every day. So we worked with districts all over the state to help them update their student information systems like Focus and Skyward to reflect only the Affirm name. And this, took some time, and still not all districts are doing it, but and we'll go through this later, there's a way to update it so that you put in like a nickname or also known as, and you select for that to populate rather than the legal name. And that protects trans youth from being outed. But the point is, before we even realized this was a huge issue, there were so many kids falling behind because the virtual learning environment was not an affirming or safe space for them. So they avoided and had, school aversion. This quote says, although stay-at-home orders are designed to keep individuals and communities safe, they present unique challenges for many LGBTQ youth. The closing of K through 12 schools may confine LGBTQ young persons to traumatic and possibly abusive environments. Many cannot be their authentic selves at home because they've not disclosed their LGBTQ status to their parents, et cetera. And I caution folks to remember that there is no one size fits all. I'm talking about experiences that I've had with particular trans youth, but among the kids that I work with, there are some who were so ready to be back in school. Their home environment was not affirming. They hated, being stuck, and they really wanted to go back to school where they could express themselves. I have other kids I'm working with right now who just straight up don't want to go back because the impact of being out of school for that long and not having to deal with other people and bullying and, the issues they may have experienced at school, their anxiety is now super exacerbated because of COVID, and they don't want to return to the in-person environment. So we have to figure out really, we have to tailor our response and our kind of strategy to the unique kid. There's no one size fits all trans kids feel this way or all trans kids feel this way, but we need to make sure that we can reintegrate these kids back into school in a way that feels safe and affirming for them. All right, so like I said, this was the worst year already for LGBTQ, anti-LGBTQ legislative attacks. More than 250 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in state legislatures, including over 35 that would prohibit trans youth from being able to access medically necessary and age-appropriate gender-affirming care. And we're going to go into a little bit, gender dysphoria and medical treatments, but this is not nuanced or brand new care. This is medically necessary care that every major medical organization, all of the leading experts have said is safe, it is effective, and it is medically necessary to keep these kids alive in many cases. Lack of access to gender affirming care. And by the way, I think most people in this probably know this, but there's this kind of silly, dramatic idea that like when we talk about gender affirming care for youth, we're saying that we should like remove the genitals of children and give, let them have gender confirmation surgery and genital surgery and top surgery and all these things at like young ages. That is not the case. The consensus, and there's standards of care. There are medical standards of care, like with anything, that lay out the criteria for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, that lay out the criteria that a person has to meet in order to get certain types of care. And we're talking about, allowing these kids to press the pause button on puberty so that they don't develop secondary sex characteristics that are irreversible and that later will require things like surgeries in order for them to live in accordance with their gender identity. And puberty blockers, puberty deferment is reversible. It's not harmful. It is, anyway, I think people's idea of what this type of care is very divorced from the reality of what it is. But 35 plus bills were introduced to prohibit access to medical care for these kids. 69 or more bills were introduced to prohibit trans youth from playing sports, including in Florida, where it passed. And over 43 bills would allow people to assert religious beliefs as a justification for refusing to provide services to LGBTQ people or those with whom they disapprove. and over 15, which I feel like we already did this, right? Does anybody else remember the whole craze of banning people from bathrooms? Like, been there, done that. The court said, no, you can't do that. However, here we are again, more than 15 bills trying to ban trans people from access to bathrooms and locker rooms consistent with their gender identity. We do know that for trans youth in school, this is a no-go for certain. Kids have to have access to the bathroom in accordance with their gender identity under Title IX. Okay, so I think it's important to remind folks of the impacts of intersectionality in the way that, earlier I was talking about, trans kids are at this disproportionate rate of, depression or suicide or whatever it is, and kids who are from a community of color, this disproportionate rate of experiencing XYZ, and kids who are homeless people don't exist in silos. You can't take pieces of your identity and separate them. A person who is Black and trans and homeless is going to experience the cumulative effects of all of the systemic, forms of discrimination that work together. And so I think that just really quickly discussing the devastating impact on LGBTQ people of color is important. So they were disproportionately impacted in that they were more likely to actually get sick, to get the virus, and many, not just LGBTQ people of color, but there are many people from vulnerable communities that because of social determinants of health that have been shown to make a person more likely or more susceptible to the virus, such as living in overcrowded conditions, experiencing homelessness, not having health insurance, living in poverty, et cetera. So just look at these statistics real quick. So whether it's becoming unemployed, work hours reduced, unpaid leave, pay cuts, switch to part-time work, when we look at the differences between the general population and trans people of color for each of these, they're almost twice as likely for some of these. I'm going to be honest, math is not my strong suit. A lot of times more likely to be impacted by these things. And so, I know that we're talking about youth, and this is about LGBTQ youth, but youth are impacted by what's going on in their home and in their household. And we know that, LGBTQ people of color are just so disproportionately impacted economically by the virus. So, that's part of the full picture. So centuries of systemic and individual racism and transphobia made them more susceptible. Like I said, so COVID-19 coincided with a record high level of violence against people in the Black community and the transgender community. The number of Black trans women that are murdered every year is so disproportionate to their percentage of the actual population. And Black trans folks are at a higher risk of being exposed, like I said, because of these social determinants of health. So Black students or LGBTQ students of color, just students of color, pre-pandemic were already more likely to attend schools with fewer resources, to have less support, to, their schools have less funding. What is happening? Okay. They were disproportionately likely to have lost a loved one due to COVID. Black children account for 20% of those who lost a parent, although they only make up 14% of the children in the US. And then the pandemic disproportionately impacted, households and communities, and exacerbated lack of access to, like I said, internet, computers, things like that, food insecurity, homelessness, and lack of access to services and supports. So 3 ways that the COVID-19 pandemic uniquely impacted trans individuals are, like I said, the postponement of non-emergency medical care meant much of their medically necessary care was just, unavailable, which increased rates of suicide, homelessness, psychological distress, et cetera. Diminished access to social supports, like I've said, cut off crucial lifelines for many of these folks. And then the shutting down of non-essential services, including courthouse and government agencies, resulted in a huge lack of access to obtaining authentic legal identification documents. And anybody who's ever worked with me knows that this is one of the pillars of the work that I do is providing access to legal name and gender marker changes to ensure that trans folks have legal authenticity. And so, when you think about folks who were unable to, get to the courthouse to file a petition for name change, were unable to schedule an appointment at the sheriff's office to do fingerprinting for the background check, unable to see their doctor to get the gender marker letter that you need to change your gender marker. For so many people, their legal transition and the access to legal authenticity was just put on hold, and that has devastating impacts. Yeah, sorry that these are all number one. I don't know how that happened. They're all just as important. That's why. Okay, so we all know that, it is very difficult to get a job, to get a house or an apartment, to apply for public benefits, to do really anything without accurate ID. If you're pulled over and I'm pulled over as a transgender woman, right? But my driver's license looks like this, and it says Joe, and it's a picture of someone that does not look like me, and the gender marker says male. Oftentimes, police make the inaccurate, but they're human assumption that that is not my driver's license, that this might not be my car, I may be committing fraud, things of that nature. And when those type of issues happen, things escalate more quickly. And we already know that, people of color have disproportionately difficult interactions with police. We know all these things that exacerbate police violence, and having inaccurate identification is a really critical piece for trans people to feel safe and to be able to participate meaningfully in society. A recent study by the Williams Institute analyzed data and showed that 55% of trans people have no identification documents reflecting their gender, their affirmed gender. So that really is a barrier to meaningful participation in society. And so just for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the name change and gender marker change work, I just want to quickly run through. So to get a court order for name change, you have to fill out all this paperwork, pay a $400 filing fee, which most people, I'm being dead serious, I've been doing this for 4 years now. Almost every day I have someone say, what? You can get that fee waived? I had no idea. Or I went to the courthouse and asked and they said no. Or, oh, well, online I read, on the court website that didn't say anything about this. People don't know that there's a filing fee waiver. So that's super important that we're letting our indigent clients know that. They have to get fingerprinted for a background check. Many, like I said, many trans folks and particularly trans folks of color have had negative experiences with law enforcement and don't really necessarily want to go to the sheriff's department and might not want to subject themselves to fingerprinting and a background check, potentially due to, many folks have concerns about former criminal history and if that will impact them. It won't, but there's a non-waivable fee for fingerprinting. Then you have to have a hearing, then you have to appear before a judge, now mostly on Zoom, but previously, appearing in open court and having to out yourself as trans, particularly in small, rural communities, that's an insurmountable barrier. And then you go through all that and people often assume there's some memo that goes out and it changes your name everywhere. False. You then still have to go through each identification document through each agency and amend the name and gender marker on your social, your driver's license, your passport, your birth certificate, etc. In order to amend your gender marker, you need a doctor's letter that says that you've gone through appropriate clinical treatment for gender transition. Why is this a barrier? What did I just talk about earlier with health insurance and access to healthcare? So many people don't have a gender affirming medical provider willing to write this letter. Many people don't have health insurance to pay for them to even go have the visit with the doctor to get this letter. And then you have to, be able to fill out all these forms and mail them out and all that good stuff, which is a really big barrier for some people. I did want to mention a recent policy change that I was able to secure, I guess, I don't know, with the DHSMV. I was having lots of trans folks submit their gender marker letters to change their IDs and other documents being denied because it was signed, the letter was signed by an APRN, and most agencies require it be signed by a MD or a DO, a physician. However, in 2020, there was a law that passed that created a new Florida statute called the Autonomous Practice Law. And it allows APRNs who are licensed to do autonomous practice to sign anywhere that a physician's signature is required. This is huge because I work with the Florida Association of Advanced Registered Nurse Practitioners. I think that's what they're called, FLANP. And the reason they advocated for the passing of this statute was the APRNs have made a really coordinated, strategic, intentional push to provide care in areas where there's lack of access to healthcare. We have like food deserts. There are health deserts where, folks cannot find gender affirming care. So I work with one provider who basically, one APRN who kind of exclusively sees LGBTQ and trans individuals. And so he was signing dozens of letters for people and they were being denied, even though, he's licensed under that statute to sign these letters. So anyway, long story short, did a demand letter and some advocacy with each of these agencies, Social Security, the Bureau of Vital Statistics, and the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles. And the DHSMV agreed that they had to comply with the statute, and they put out a new policy that says, a letter signed by an APRN has to be accepted under this statute, blah, blah, blah. So that's a great victory. And I'll send that around when I send the PowerPoint and other materials, because for anybody working with the trans community, they're more likely to see an APRN, ARNP. Oh, now I can't remember. Anyway, they're more likely to see one of those people than an actual physician. So just wanted to give that quick FYI. Still waiting on the actual policy to change with Social Security and the Bureau of Vital Statistics. All right, so the importance of legal authenticity. Studies, like really comprehensive, groundbreaking studies, have shown that access to legal identification documents is a structural intervention for establishing economic stability for trans individuals, given the central role that ID documents play in accessing all the things we need to meaningfully participate in society. So these studies showed that among women of color, transgender women of color, those who had obtained a legal name change were 5 times more likely to be able to make more than $1,000 a month, and 3 times more likely to be able to rent an apartment or a home. Having gender concordant IDs directly results in decreases in depression, suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, and psychological distress. For trans youth in particular, though we're going to go through in a little bit kind of the legal framework for representing these kids and how you can advocate for them to be affirmed in all aspects of the school environment, even in the absence of a legal name or gender marker change. For trans youth, having a birth certificate that shows their correct name and their correct gender marker can be life-changing and can make everything so much easier in getting the school to treat them in an affirming way. And really just in their interactions, when they get their first driver's license, they don't have to get it in the wrong name and gender marker and then go back and change it. They can sort of grow up and join society as who they are without all the barriers that trans adults who didn't have access to these processes have to overcome. So for those who don't know, we created this first of its kind website, Florida Name Change. I'm not going to go into it a lot, but basically, if you have clients that need access to the name and gender marker change process, or you're curious, this website provides, all of the forms that you need and all the information you need to update your name in all 67 counties, and then walks you through Social Security, driver's license, passport, birth certificate, etc., how to help your clients update their name and gender marker on those. It's kind of like TurboTax, where you just click some easy buttons and it auto-populates the forms for you. All the county specific resources are listed. Like I said, it walks you through and auto-populates the forms for you, making it really simple. They're sent to you all filled out and ready to be filed. And again, this right here, the application for determination of civil indigent status, on the website, it's listed as a filing fee waiver, because I think indigent status is a sort of stigmatizing term that deters some people from clicking on it. So it's just a filing fee waiver. Most of my clients, if not all, qualify. And again, that waives the $400 fee. All right. So I'm going to actually pause there and see if there are any questions.
Everyone must still be soaking all this good information in. I don't see any questions at the moment.
Or they all dropped off.
They're all still here. We even gained one just now.
Wow. Okay. All right. I will continue.
All right, and I did put in the chat that you have the name change and gender marker clinic coming up
Yes.
in about a week. So I posted the link to that, everyone, if you want to share with clients who could use that.
I appreciate that. That's something I am supposed to be remembering to bring up, and I keep forgetting. So yeah, we're doing a statewide virtual legal name change clinic that we're collaborating with Ackerman attorneys on, pro bono attorneys. And I did like a 2-hour really comprehensive training for all of their pro bono attorneys so that they are culturally competent, so that they're ready to work with the trans community. And I know they won't, dead name or misgender people, and walk through the whole name and gender marker change process with them. So in the clinic, what's cool is, folks will be put in a one-on-one like breakout room with an attorney who will help them fill out all the paperwork and be able to help them navigate the process. So we're trying to build capacity statewide of folks that are doing this work, because I mean, on Florida Name Change, we've had, like 160,000 people use the site since we launched it in 2018. And we've helped thousands, with legal name change and updating their documents, yet there's still so many people that need access to this process. So anybody who's interested in doing name and gender marker change work, please let me know. All right, so language matters. Using affirming language is super important. Being an ally is important. Combating homophobia and transphobia everywhere we see it is part of allyship. And I think it's a duty incumbent upon all of us. Particularly, we need to be using affirming and inclusive language because we're mandated by the ethical rules and the rules of professional responsibility to be competent. And that includes cultural competency. Outing, I just want to quickly mention, is, disclosing another person's LGBTQ status without their permission or consent. And this is a tricky one when it comes to the type of work that we do, where, oftentimes we have to collect their legal name and their sex assigned at birth. And, the legal name would need to go on a pleading and things like that. So their transgender identity is relevant to the extent that, your associates and your secretary and whoever understand that the person you're talking about, who you're using their affirm name, is the person in the records who has, this other name. But it's really important that we don't make a person's LGBTQ identity like the focus of our representation. When people come to us for legal advice and legal assistance, oftentimes it's for issues unrelated to their LGBTQ identity. And you wouldn't ask just any client that came in that's, facing eviction, like, who are you attracted to? And what do your genitals look like? That's not relevant to their eviction. So making sure we're not, like I said, unnecessarily making their LGBTQ identity like the focus of the representation. All right, we talked about this. Important to know that transgender is an adjective. We don't say transgendered. It implies something happened to a person to make them that way, and that's not the case. We don't say transgenders. And the TGNC is a phrase used to describe the transgender and gender non-conforming community. You might see TGNC NB, and NB is non-binary. Cisgender, like I said, are people who are not transgender, whose sex assigned at birth corresponds to their gender identity, and they can be any sexual orientation. So not all trans people are gay, not all gay people are trans, etc. All right. Gender nonconforming and non-binary, like we said, we already talked about these terms. It's just good to know, like, a lot of youth these days are identifying as non-binary. So just having a concept of what that means. And the most important thing, honestly, is mirroring language. So it is totally fine if you don't understand yourself non-binary, you don't really get it, or you don't, or any of the terms that folks might use to describe their own identity. You don't have to understand it, and you don't have to agree with it. You just have to respect that that's how that person identifies, and you need to use the name and pronouns that they ask you to use, and reflect the language that they use back at them. So if you mirror language, you'll be good. All right, pronouns matter. So I introduced myself. I'm Simone. My pronouns are she and her. every meeting, I introduce myself that way, because when you let someone know what your pronouns are, you open the door to first letting them know you're a safe and inclusive space, but also you allow them to tell you what pronouns they use. And it is not always abundantly obvious that a person is trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming. And so we shouldn't only introduce ourselves with our pronouns or ask a person, what pronouns do you use if they look trans, because we're then making an assumption about that person. And the reality is we all interact with LGBTQ plus folks every day, and we don't necessarily know it. So we should just make that the standard, that we use our pronouns and allow them to share their pronouns. And the reason it's so important is for trans and non-binary youth, those who report having their pronouns respected by all or most of the people in their lives, it cut the attempted suicide rate in half. I mean, if that's not like all you need to know to just start using your pronoun should be in your signature block. Mine are usually it says Simone Chris on Zoom, and then it says she, her, but I'm on my wife's computer, so it, I think, didn't log into my account. Anyway, the point is putting it in anywhere that your name is, having your pronouns is helpful, and it can really actually save kids' lives by making, use of pronouns like a common thing that everybody is aware of. This was a Trevor Project survey in 2020 that showed this. All right, so gender dysphoria is the DSM-5 diagnosis, not of being transgender. Being transgender is not a diagnosis or a disability or a mental health issue. However, for folks whose sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity, they sometimes experience discomfort and distress that is caused by the discrepancy, and that manifests as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, psychological distress, etc. But the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is a diagnosis for those manifestations, depression, anxiety, all of those things, not a diagnosis of being transgender. I hope that makes sense. Unfortunately, while we don't want to inappropriately pathologize being transgender, because it's just a normal variant in human condition, in order to get treatment in order to get gender affirming care, so hormones, access to surgeries, things like that, you need a diagnosis, because that's just how our healthcare system works in the US. So many trans people need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and sometimes we can facilitate getting them in touch with a gender affirming provider, a gender affirming therapist. We should all have lists that we can refer to. If people ask, who do you recommend? We should have LGBTQ support groups, in our area that we work in, that we can refer people to. We should have, again, gender affirming healthcare providers, all that good stuff. And not all trans people experience gender dysphoria. All right, so trans youth. I touched on this earlier, but this is a very hot button issue right now. Lots of people who have never met a trans person and have never talked to trans youth or their doctors, and who don't really understand what medically necessary gender affirming care for youth looks like, are very upset about it. And so according to the DSM and the experts in WPATH and everyone that actually understands these issues, children typically begin expressing their gender identity between 2 and 4. Even that young, trans kids are often persistent and insistent about their gender, differentiating this from, a phase or imaginative play, or, I was a tomboy stereotypically. And people often, when I'm trying to talk to them about this stuff, are like, oh, what if you had been, diagnosed as trans because you were a tomboy? I never felt like I was trapped in the wrong body. My brain didn't tell me that I was a boy. I just liked wearing boys' clothes and, didn't fit into stereotypical expectations of little girls versus little boys. For trans youth, this is not the case. And so to alleviate the distress, all of the negative aspects that come with having a gender identity that doesn't match your sex assigned at birth and not being affirmed just by society at large or by your family or whomever, to alleviate the distress, the medical experts and healthcare providers recommend that children socially transition. So social transition is just living in accordance with your gender identity, dressing in accordance with your gender identity, using the name that you feel most comfortable using the pronouns that are associated with your gender identity, haircuts, like things like that. And this is so critical to kids' mental health and stability and ability to, navigate the world and even just learn at school. Social transition has incredible impacts on trans youth. And every major medical organization and association, American Medical Association, Psychological Association, pediatric, everyone that you can think of agrees, there's a consensus that this is medically necessary treatment for gender dysphoria is safe, necessary, and effective. Puberty deferment, hormone blockers are the thing that many people are all up in arms about. And again, this is a reversible treatment that just stops endogenous puberty. So, for instance, for trans youth who are trans females, this makes it so that the effects of testosterone on the body are not experienced. And so they don't go through male puberty. They don't go through female puberty. It hits the pause button on the development of secondary sex characteristics. And it allows for kids to, work with their mental health provider and their families and their communities to ensure that, this is how they really feel, that they meet the criteria for, later gender affirming care. But, anyway, I won't get into all the trans sports ban stuff, but basically it, once, if a kid, let's say no harm, no foul decides, actually, I'm not trans, you stop puberty deferment, you stop blockers, and they progress as normal and go through, the endogenous puberty of their sex assigned at birth. So again, our country's kind of made this into a huge, crazy issue that it really doesn't need to be. These are some of the terms that folks might use in explaining their own identity. Like I said earlier, doesn't matter if you know what they all mean. You don't need flashcards and definitions. You just need to affirm and respect a person for who they say they are. So the gender affirmation transition process is the period in time when you start living in accordance with your gender identity. What's important to understand is, for some people, they don't have the privilege and ability to live full-time in accordance with their gender identity. I have kids who I work with who are not out at home, but who express their gender identity at school or in their social groups. I have adults that I work with who are not out at work. So their gender expression at work looks different than their gender expression at home because of fear of losing employment, being kicked out, discrimination. We know trans women of color are murdered at a disproportionately high rate. So there are a lot of reasons why a person might not be able to live full-time in accordance with their gender identity. And so it's important that we recognize that, because we might see a client one day and they're presenting one way, and see them another day and they're presenting another way, and not understand why that might be. All right. So there's social transition, which we talked about, just living in accordance with your gender identity. Medical interventions, medical transition, including, blockers, cross-sex hormones, gender affirming surgeries, and then legal transition, which is what we talked about with access to legal name and gender marker change. Remember all the insane barriers and obstacles pre-COVID, post-COVID. It's going to always exist, unfortunately. That, if you don't have, so for trans youth, for instance, in order to get a legal name change, they need their parents to petition the court on their behalf. That requires, one, that they have affirming and supportive parents, which many youth don't, or they'll have one parent that is and one parent that's opposed. Two, that their parents have access to, the resources needed to navigate this process, that they have access to transportation to get to and from the hearing, the fingerprinting, and if the parent, let's say the parent has a felony conviction and their civil rights have been revoked, the parent then can't petition on the minor child's behalf to obtain a legal name change. These folks have limited access to medical care, etc. So there's just a host of obstacles and barriers to a person's ability to just simply live authentically in accordance with their gender identity. All right. I feel like most people understand this by now. Those of us who are cisgender inherently have privilege in the fact that our sex assigned at birth and gender identity are aligned. And then I'm not, but the folks who are heterosexual have the privileges of, not experiencing the things that gay people have to worry about on a daily basis, just interacting in a society where there's stigma. All right, so best practices. Introduce yourself with your pronouns. We covered that. Demonstrate inclusivity. It doesn't take a lot. Y'all see this little rainbow pin I have here? That alone sends a signal to an LGBTQ youth I'm working with who might have had really bad experiences with adults in their life, who, you know, has probably been dead named and misgendered by doctors and lawyers and teachers and whomever else. You can demonstrate allyship really easily with a sticker on the wall of your office, a pin, you know, introducing yourself with your pronouns, all those things. The flag on the left, for those who don't know, is the transgender pride flag, and the flag on the right is the inclusive LGBTQ pride flag, which includes acknowledging communities of color are also a part of the LGBTQ community. So that's why there's the black and the brown line. There's a flag that is the like header of each of the slide like topic changes that has the inclusive flag with the trans pride flag cutting into it, which I'll show you when we get to the next time I show it. But it's a really cool flag that I really like. Anyone can use it. It was made by a man named Daniel Quasar. And you can go on his website and download like the image. You can also buy the flags for your house or office or whatever. All right, inclusive intake forms. It's super important that at this day and age, 2021, all of us have intake forms at our legal aid organizations, our offices, our whatever, that allow space for trans people to exist. So when we only ask for legal name and sex, we are creating a situation where we're just not allowing trans folks to kind of fill it out accurately. So we should ask for legal name and affirm name. We should ask for sex assigned at birth and gender identity. We should always ask for pronouns. And even though, like I said, we may need to use legal name and stuff like that in pleadings, when we're talking to someone, interacting with someone, we should only use affirm name and affirm pronouns. Avoid gendered greetings, create a welcoming office or Zoom environment, make sure that your bathrooms are accessible, yeah, language, allyship, all of this is super important. All right, so now we're gonna get into a little bit of the unique issues faced by LGBTQ students. I'm gonna kind of run through this quickly because I think I've kind of hit the point home that these kids need our advocacy and our protection. And I know so many of you are working with LGBTQ youth and, you know, doing school advocacy or dependency work or delinquency work where you're interacting with these kids. And I think that we all probably have a pretty good understanding at this point of the discrimination these kids face. But most trans kids, even kids who aren't trans but were perceived as trans, maybe due to being gender non-conforming or non-binary, experience mistreatment at school. The majority of LGB, so gay, lesbian, and bisexual students also experience mistreatment in school, including, this is important, hearing remarks, I don't know how to make it, whatever, hearing negative remarks about sexual orientation by peers and teachers. So it's really important that when we're working with these kids in education, you know, even if it's totally unrelated to their LGBTQ identity, we're, you know, at an IEP meeting, we need to make sure that the language that the school and the folks interacting with these kids are using is affirming language so that we can keep them in school and allow them to feel safe. All right, again, most of these kids feel unsafe at school. This results in dropping out, lower GPAs, more likely to miss school, less likely to plan on continuing higher education. These kids are avoiding all of the things that, you know, make high school like fun. Not that academics aren't fun. Maybe some people loved high school. I didn't. Like if I hadn't been on the girls' soccer team, you know, that was sort of my community where I felt like I belonged. And these kids are just excluded in many places from being a part of any of these gender segregated spaces and school functions. Again, the push out, these kids leave school when there's a lack of an affirming environment, then they're more likely to be one of the statistics I showed you at the beginning, you know, unemployment, poverty, homelessness, et cetera. You know, having education, having a high school diploma or a GED is really important in being able to be economic stability later in life. They're more likely to be subject to school-based discipline. And they're more likely to experience bullying. Over 77% of trans youth experience bullying, and COVID has really exacerbated. I mean, cyberbullying was already a problem, but in the COVID world, the not having to like see each other every day and kind of like deal face to face with the terrible things you've been saying, and the just sort of national climate that's been created around transgender individuals and the attacks on their, dignity and safety and their rights has really exacerbated the cyberbullying and all that good stuff, not good stuff, bad stuff. And it's important that there's SESIR reporting requirements in Florida that require certain, pieces of data to be collected with regard to bullying instances. So it's really important that we make sure the kids we're working with are having their bullying and harassment reports taken seriously and documented appropriately, because we're in a place where we're finally starting to collect data about these things that impact LGBTQ people. For so long, this data wasn't even collected. So we didn't really have these statistics to show these disparities. So we need to make sure that instances of bullying against LGBTQ kids are reported and documented so that we can encourage policy changes that need to happen. All right, the most common forms of discrimination at school by LGBTQ youth are discriminatory policies around bathroom, locker room use, participation in athletics, etc., dead naming and misgendering, bullying and harassment, disclosure of confidential information, and enforcement of unreasonable application of school dress code. We'll go through the legal protections for these in a bit. And a lot of these things I'm going to go through kind of quickly, but at the end, I'm going to share with you a resource. I have created a series of legal notes with Equality Florida, which is the LGBTQ advocacy organization in the state. They have a safe and healthy schools program. And so there's a series of legal notes that I've written on each of the topics that are, the most common issues faced by LGBTQ youth at school. And they're 2-pagers for the most part, where like one page explains to the district and the teachers and staff, these are your legal obligations to protecting LGBTQ students. And the other page is like a know your rights self-advocacy tool for youth and parents to use, and attorneys. I've shared them with lots of attorneys to represent these kids' needs. So all of this is like in detail in those legal notes if you want them. And I'm going to send them to Christy at the end to share with everyone along with the PowerPoint. All right. Hostile school climates have lasting negative consequences. We understand that. Oh, someone raised their hand. Christy, I don't know what to do. Whoever raised their hand, if you want to just ask a question, you're more than welcome to. Or maybe it was an accident. I'm going to keep going. Students who are discriminated against and victimized at school have lower self-esteem and higher levels of depression. This Doe v. Yuntis case does a really good job of explaining the ways that discriminatory policies impact kind of every aspect of a trans kid's life and experience at school. So I highly recommend taking a look at that. We definitely already discussed this, but another reminder, lots of anti-trans bills. The one that passed in Florida is ironically called the Fairness in Women's Sports Act. In my opinion, it has very little to do with fairness. For those who weren't maybe like following this super closely, the Florida High School Athletic Association has allowed trans kids to play in accordance with their gender identity for about 10 years. And there's never been one single reported instance or incident related to a trans female playing sports with other females, not one. And in the entire almost 10 years, only 11 trans students have actually played sports in accordance with their gender identity. Of those 11, 2 were trans females, one of whom was on the bowling team, the other of who it was so long ago, they aren't sure what sport she played. So this was a non-issue that we passed a law that just sends a very clear message to trans youth that they are not equal and that we think they are a danger, a threat to other girls. Trans girls are girls. They're girls like everyone else. They should play on the girls team. This ban requires students to play, girls to play on the team that matches their birth certificate at the time of birth. So even these kids that have gone through the whole process, like I explained to you earlier, of legal name change, gender marker change, updating their birth certificate, doesn't matter because it's about what was on the original birth certificate. So yeah, this is directly in conflict with the NCAA, the Olympic standards, like literally high school kids in Florida are subjected to more rigorous standards than Olympic athletes. Very silly. All right. All right, youth and care. I know lots of folks that were on the webinar last time and that I work with in the state, work with LGBTQ or work with foster youth. So I just quickly wanted to explain that among foster youth, LGBTQ youth are disproportionately impacted by so many negative things, including many of these kids are forced to leave their home because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Over 30% suffered physical violence at the hands of a family member after coming out. Then we put them into this sex segregated system where 78% of them endure further harassment or abuse when they're placed in out-of-home care. 70% of youth in group homes reported violence based on their LGBTQ status. And nearly 80% of LGBTQ youth surveyed in this national survey were removed or ran away from their foster placements as a result of hostility toward their sexual orientation or gender identity. So for those of us who are working with this, vulnerable intersection of LGBTQ youth in the foster care system, make sure that the placements we're making sure the placements are affirming, that they're not going to do things like conversion therapy, that they're not going to put the kid in a sex segregated space with kids that are of a different gender. If a kid identifies as female, they need to be placed with females. If they identify as male, they need to be placed with males, unless the child, for their own, they feel safer being with people with their sex assigned at birth. But we should not force kids to be in sex segregated placements that don't match their gender identity. So there's this, horrible cycle where they're kicked out and then they're placed in a sex segregated system where they don't have, I'm an attorney ad litem for foster youth with special needs on the registry here. And, so many of these kids don't have, control over where they're placed. They don't have control over sometimes even the clothes that are bought for them that are gender specific, over, just so many aspects of their life are out of their control and are very gendered. And so there's just lots of ways that we can work with these kids to make sure that they have a more affirming experience, because we don't want them to continue running away from unsupportive placements and ending up homeless, because so many trans folks experience homelessness. And so we want to try to, break this cycle. So only 5 to 7% of youth identify as LGBTQ, but they make up 25% of those in foster care, 20% of those in the juvenile justice system, and nearly 50% of those experiencing homelessness. So talk about disproportionate, rates. Okay, this is the flag I was talking about, by the way. It is super cool. It's my favorite flag. So the legal framework for representing trans youth. When we're talking about defending the rights of trans youth, what we're talking about is access to a safe and affirming learning environment, access to legal authenticity, dignity, and respect, access to sex segregated spaces in accordance with their gender identity, access to privacy, informational and bodily autonomy, and access to freedom to exist free from discrimination, harassment, bullying, and violence. So what are the laws that protect these kids? Title IX is the federal law banning sex discrimination in schools, and the Supreme Court decision in Bostock made clear that sex includes sexual orientation and transgender status. They very clearly said that it is impossible to discriminate against someone on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity without discriminating on the basis of sex. Previously, we still believed and enforced that Title IX protected LGBTQ youth, but it was through a less direct route where we said, historically, the Supreme Court, there's all these decisions establishing that sex discrimination includes discrimination on the basis of sex stereotypes or failing to conform with sex stereotypes. You look at the VMI case, Frontier v. Richardson, all these cases that establish that, Price Waterhouse. And so therefore, trans people are inherently gender non-conforming and don't comply with sex stereotypes. Therefore, they're protected under sex discrimination. But the Supreme Court said, no, sex, just the word sex by itself obviously includes sexual orientation and transgender status. We know that courts rely on Title VII when interpreting Title IX. So it did not take long for the Bostock framework to be applied to Title IX. And it is now clear that LGBTQ students are protected from discrimination under Title IX's prohibition on sex discrimination. The Drew Adams case here in our circuit, the 11th Circuit, and the Brim v. Gloucester case, which, like I said yesterday, it's finally been put to bed. The Supreme Court denied cert on that case. And so that ruling stands. So we know that school districts can't exclude students from using the bathrooms that match their gender identity, but beyond that, now with Bostock, this is not just with bathrooms. They must provide LGBTQ students equal access to all education programs and activities. And this is even in circumstances where others raise objections. And there's a resolution agreement that goes through that and does a really good job of explaining that. So the Federal Register Notice of Interpretation, again, made clear that this applies to Title IX, and it cites a few more cases than I actually included in this PowerPoint. So I recommend checking out, in addition to Brim and Adams, the Cohnke and Doe cases applying Bostock. All right, so what about sports? The Department of Justice, filed a statement of interest in the case. There's a case in West Virginia where there was a trans sports ban, and there's a case in Idaho where there was a trans sports ban. Those are the two that have been challenged thus far. And in Idaho, the Hecox case, a federal court granted a preliminary injunction on that, and it's on appeal right now. But I think it's really good to know that the Department of Justice filed a statement of interest, basically saying that Title IX prohibits categorically excluding transgender females from participating in single-sex sports. I recommend reading this. It's a great read and kind of puts into context all of these legal fights about access to sports and other sex-segregated places. All right. So super important to know how, if necessary, the IDEA in Section 504 can be utilized as a tool to protect LGBTQ and particularly transgender youth. So as we're approaching the start of the next school year, and we're focused on, okay, let's re-up, let's modify and make sure that kids who already have 504s and IEPs, that they're appropriate, that they're still meeting their needs, that they take into account all the things that happened during COVID, maybe new mental health needs, maybe new academic supports required based on regression, whatever. For many trans youth, these can be utilized as tools to provide them access to a safe and affirming learning environment if the school is otherwise unable or unwilling to do so. Being trans is not a disability, like I said, but students can qualify for a IEP or 504 plan on the basis of their gender dysphoria diagnosis or other diagnoses unrelated to gender identity because of the anxiety, depression, and psychological distress that many trans students experience. I have experienced firsthand that sometimes this requires education, like us as attorneys, to educate the school board attorney and the special education services director, the folks who we work with in the special education process. Sometimes they need a little mini cultural competency training and help in understanding why this is gender dysphoria and kids who are trans can qualify for a 504 plan or IEP based on their gender dysphoria. All right, you guys all know what the IDEA says. Kids have need to have access to the learning environment. They can provide supports and accommodations necessary to allow trans students to meaningfully participate in school. The two categories that I've been successful in getting trans students to qualify under when they didn't have a separate disability that was explicitly listed under the IDEA are emotional disability and other health impairment. Under Section 504, which doesn't have an enumerated list of disabilities, but rather if a student has something that's denying them from participating in school, then they can get a 504 plan. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't list specific disabilities, but anything that impairs or substantively limits one or more major life activities, and learning is considered a major life activity. So if you read the Adams case, the Gavin Brim case, and you look at the ways in which like not being able to use the bathroom that matches your gender identity, not having teachers use the name and pronoun that you use, how that actually impedes, impacts, and in some cases prohibits learning. If you're sitting there in class and you're supposed to be paying attention to this math problem on the board, but all you can think about is, oh my God, I have to pee so bad. I still have 3 more classes today. I have to hold it. If I go to the bathroom, XYZ might happen. You're not paying attention. You're not able to get the full benefits of the education environment. All right, Equal Protection Clause also protects LGBTQ kids. In the Adams case and the Brim case, they use the Equal Protection Clause in addition to Title IX, making clear that this is sex discrimination. In the 11th Circuit, we have really clear precedent under Glenn versus Brumby that discrimination against a transgender person is sex discrimination. So policies that classify students based on transgender status or sexual orientation are subject to intermediate scrutiny, which means the school has to have a legitimate interest in banning the kids or having the policy that segregates on the basis of sex. And we now know that there is really no good reason, because in the first full trial of its kind in Adams, the school board could not produce evidence of a single incident across the whole country that demonstrated that allowing trans kids to use the bathroom that matches their gender identity was could cause harm to or invade the privacy rights of other students. So it kind of put those justifications on trial, and the justifications did not withstand scrutiny. FERPA is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. It protects personal information. This means that a transgender student under FERPA can request that information about their gender identity, which includes their sex assigned at birth, their dead name, their gender dysphoria diagnosis, things like that, they can keep those pieces of information from being disclosed. So FERPA is one of the tools that I've used to encourage schools, even in the absence of a legal name and gender marker change, to update the student information system to reflect only the affirmed name and affirmed gender marker or pronouns, because otherwise the school is inadvertently outing this student to classmates, teachers, peers, anyone else, when they use that personal information about them being transgender. So you can request that the school amend the student's education record if it's inaccurate, misleading, or in violation of the student's privacy. So what we do is we argue it's inaccurate because the student's James, not Jessica. The student is a boy, not a girl. It's misleading because everyone knows him as a boy and everyone knows his name is James. And it violates his privacy rights by outing him and subjecting him to, look at all the statistics. Kids who are LGBTQ, particularly trans, are more likely to experience harassment, violence, all of those things. So it violates the student's privacy and safety interests by disclosing their transgender status without their consent. Freedom of expression. So dress code, uniform policies, this is not really the case for most public schools, but if there are schools where they have different gender, different uniform policies or dress codes based on sex, we need to make sure that students are able to express themselves and not be disciplined based on the way that they're presenting and expressing themselves. We know that students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. They said that in 1969 when students were protesting the Vietnam War. Kids have a First Amendment right. And so this includes expressing their gender identities through their appearance and attire, wearing, pro-LGBTQ messages. We've worked with kids who were disciplined or sent home because they had like a gay pride flag on their shirt or something of that nature. So as long as they're not being disruptive to the classroom or disruptive to the school environment, they should not be denied the ability to express themselves. Privacy rights. All right, so kids have a right to be out at school, but that their right to be out at school does not mean that teachers and staff can disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity to others. This is a tricky area because parents do have strong parental rights over children to, determine their upbringing and all that good stuff. But kids have their own right to informational privacy separate from their parents' rights. And so, if it's sensitive information, that the disclosure of which to their family or their parents would put them at risk of harm, teachers and school districts need to balance those competing interests, the parents' fundamental right to access information related to their child and the student's right to informational privacy about things that could subject them to harm. I have a whole legal note just on informational privacy. It's like the only one that's like 4 pages rather than a 2-sheeter, just because it's a really important topic right now with the introduction of the new parental rights bill that passed in Florida. Lots of folks are, asking, school district folks have contacted me asking, does this mean that we have to out LGBTQ kids to their parents? And so I'm not speaking to what the bill says, what it means, how it's going to be interpreted. I'm just reminding folks that students have federal constitutional rights that are separate from their parents' rights. And it's important that we protect their right to informational privacy. All right, so practical application. We need to make sure that if we're utilizing the IDEA in Section 504, that we are, come on, I already talked about this, that the person doing the assessment is affirming and understands trans issues. Because if you have someone that has no idea about, gender dysphoria, trying to evaluate a student for whether they qualify for an IEP or 504 plan as a result of their gender dysphoria, that's not going to result in an appropriate and accurate assessment. So we need to make sure that the assessment is conducted in a non-discriminatory manner. Implementation. So, folks often ask, what does the IEP and 504 plan have to do with like bathroom access and pronouns? I have been able to successfully write into IEPs and 504 plans as specific accommodations and supports access to the bathroom that matches the student's gender identity, consistent use of affirmed name and pronouns, including with substitute teachers. So many of the trans youth that I work with are outed by substitute teachers on accident. It's inadvertent. It's not like a hostility, bias thing. It's when the roster's printed, oftentimes it just has the legal name. So you have to, you can write into one of these plans that in order for the student to have access to the learning environment as required under these federal special education laws, they need use of their affirmed name consistently. And that reminds the school to ensure they're not outed through substitute teacher rosters, the yearbook, ID badges, things like that. So these are just some of the services and accommodations that we've been able to get implemented in a 504 IEP. So we discussed the first two. So providing stress breaks throughout the day for kids who experience anxiety at school, making sure that there's a staff member who is LGBTQ affirming, who the student knows is their kind of like support person that they can go to when they need support, arranging for counseling, particularly for kids who don't have access to services and mental health care outside of school, making sure that they have access to an affirming mental health provider in school, social worker, whatever, potentially including the parents in that if the parents need help kind of getting to a place where they can be affirming to their child. Homebound or online services, if necessary. That should never be just the go-to, because these kids need the emotional and social development that comes from, interacting with others and being around their peers. But for kids who, I've worked with kids who had such traumatizing experiences at school that what was needed for them was to do homebound for a limited period of time until we could get the school do training, LGBTQ cultural competency training, and get the school to be a place where that student felt safe returning to. And then functional behavior assessments can be helpful, and behavior plans to address non-attendance for kids who, like I said, have had really bad experiences and are now experiencing school aversion and not wanting to go. Maybe starting with half days, making sure that all the teachers are on the same page and are at the meeting and know what name and pronouns use, things like that. Updating school records, we talked about this. This is super important for these kids. When kids have gotten a court-ordered legal name change, there's absolutely no excuse. The school has to change their records and always ask that they're updated retroactively so that kids aren't outed by their transcripts. When they go off to apply for college or jobs or whatever things we hope they will end up pursuing, their transcripts don't have one name and then another name and require the student to unnecessarily out themselves to, the college or to the job or the scholarship or whatever it is. But again, even if a student hasn't gotten a legal name or gender marker change, which many kids don't have access to because they don't have affirming parents, or they were born in a state where they can't update their birth certificate, etc., use FERPA, use Title IX, explain the discriminatory impact and the violation of a student's privacy rights and safety of continuing to use the dead name in the student information system. I was able to get a few districts right before graduation this past academic year to put students' affirmed names on their diplomas, even when these are students that hadn't had legal name changes yet. because there's no legal requirement that a school has to use the legal name on anything other than standardized like state tests, FSAs, those type of assessments, and official transcripts. So anywhere else, student ID badges, lunchroom cards, library cards, yearbooks, diplomas, all of that advocate that it should be just the Affirm name. And some schools are like super resistant to this, which is why we have these legal notes that lay out the case law and explain why it is their duty to do this in order to protect the student. A lot of schools say, nope, we're not doing it till we see the birth certificate. So in instances where you can amend the child's birth certificate, work with the family to do so. But even if you can't, again, there's so many arguments to be made why they should update everything to reflect Affirm name and Affirm gender marker. All right, I had to learn some of these the hard way, places that you don't just automatically think about asking the school district IT folks to update. But, you know, I had a kid who I told you guys this last year, who was outed through the yearbook after I thought I had been so careful and gone through every single place where his name might be to change it. And because the yearbook was sent to the printer like early in the semester, he ended up being outed to the whole school because his dead name appeared by his picture. So really thinking through all the places where a name might appear, and because the schools aren't, you know, just going to proactively oftentimes just go ahead and do all these things. All right, additional areas of education advocacy, resource comparability. This comes from the really awesome comprehensive like letter to educators that the current administration put out, the Department of Education put out, which I'm going to include in the materials, but making sure that school districts are providing students with equal access to educational resources, including safe school facilities, instructional materials, technology, skilled educators, et cetera. There's a Dear Colleague letter that describes all of this really well. Right now, we're going to be seeing a lot of displaced and relocated students as a result of the pandemic. So ensuring that they're not facing discrimination when they're enrolling in a new school, that proof of residency isn't being required for kids who are considered homeless, which many more people are homeless now than were pre-pandemic. Understanding the federal McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And then, yeah, again, providing access to schools and learning environment without requiring the typical documentation that's required, because for some families, they simply can't provide this, and this will preclude kids from getting back into school. So these are all just things to kind of think about as we're working with vulnerable youth and you know, looking to the next upcoming school year. So again, on our website, under our work, LGBTQ equality, promoting LGBTQ equality, there is a list of all of the legal notes. These are just some of them, but you know, they cover different specific topics: use of Affirm name and pronouns, access to restrooms and sex segregated activities, athletics, dress code, bullying, etc. It's just a quick example of what they kind of look like. And again, I'm going to put all of these in a folder and send them to Christy to share with everyone along with the PowerPoint after this. All right. Do we have any questions? I'm going to show you my contact info if anyone wants to like jot that down. If you have any questions at all, I'm always happy to answer them. My goal is for like everyone in the state who works with LGBTQ youth in any fashion, particularly legal, you know, to have all the resources they need to provide really good care and services to this community. So please always feel free to email, call. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, if that's okay, so that I can see people.
You won't be able to see people, but you can at least see the chat. It's a webinar, it's pretty locked down, but thank you so much for all that information. It's kind of mind-blowing to think about all the layers of discrimination and how many discrete areas there can be for things to go wrong during the whole process. So I really appreciate you educating all of us. We did have some good questions come in.
Great.
I know you addressed this briefly, but do you need parental consent to change your name if you're under 18?
Yes. So unless the child has been emancipated, they need the parent has to be the one to petition on the child's behalf. I have worked though with kids in the dependency system where we kind of found creative, when there's not a legal parent, what do you do? And in one case, we were able to have the attorney ad litem petition. In another case, I believe it was the caseworker who petitioned. So if you have like specific questions about minors, please let me know. But in general, yes, the parent has to petition the court to request the name change. The parent gets fingerprinted. And then the issue that we run into most frequently is like, what if one parent doesn't consent or one parent's out of the picture and you don't know where they are? If you go on Florida name change or just pull up the Supreme Court approved petition for minor name change, it explains how to serve process on the other parent. I will say I've helped hundreds of kids and families through this process, many of whom didn't have two supportive parents or two affirming parents. And I've never once seen a unaffirming or like non-supportive parent that doesn't consent be able to successfully oppose a name change. Because what good faith reason are you going to give the judge for why your trans kid shouldn't have legal authenticity and be affirmed for who they are? I hope that answered your question.
Fantastic. And I put the link to Southern Legal's website that Simone was just referencing. So I'll try to remember to include all these in the follow-up email with the recording and the PowerPoint and the other resources.
Awesome.
Have you seen any issues with youth changing their names while in foster care? So you just touched on that. So
yeah, it's really tough. It's really tough given the lack of, again, like a legal parent or guardian. There are ways to accomplish it. You got to have an affirming team that's willing to kind of like creatively troubleshoot the different potential avenues. If the parent hasn't been TPR'd, that's really tough. The parent still has their parental rights and they don't consent. But what I recommend and strongly suggest is, rather than trying to get the legal name change before they're 18, working to convince and assure the judge, the caseworkers, the guardian ad litem, everyone involved in the case, why only the affirmed name should be used on, documents in court and, on their case records. The legal name should be considered protected health information in the same way that, personal medical information and things like that are protected and aren't, just shared with everyone. So there's a lot of ways to allow kids in foster care to live authentically and in accordance with their gender identity, even in the absence of access to that legal process.
I heard a lot of that through your presentation. Think creatively about how to use the tools that we do have to help kids. Let's say that we have a teacher that is new to the class and they ask for the child's preferred name rather than a dead name, or even asking about pronouns. Will that violate the non-disclosure policy? So just the act of asking, is that a violation?
I'm not sure I totally understand.
I think this person means if the teacher is only asking that one child for the preferred name rather than the whole class. I hope I'm interpreting that correctly.
No, that's a very interesting question. I think that, if the teacher is asking that individual student to be affirming so that the teacher can make sure they're using the affirmed name and pronouns, that's something we should encourage. If they're standing in front of the classroom and pointing to the kids who look maybe gender non-conforming or trans and saying, announce your pronouns because y'all seem different, that's obviously very problematic. But I think, in my experience, and I've worked with, the most conservative rural school districts in the state at this point. And in most instances, it is not like bias or malice or ill intent. It is not, I don't mean ignorance in a mean way, but like literally just never having interacted with this population, never having heard these terms or understood, kind of the components of gender identity and why pronouns matter and things like that. And for these schools and districts that we all can encourage to allow, myself or Equality Florida or whomever to come in and do LGBTQ cultural competency training, these teachers want to protect the kids for the most part. I've had a few that were just bigots, but for the most part, they want to create a safe and affirming environment where the kids want to come to school every day. They just need help learning the tools to do so.
Have any experience with a marital settlement agreement that blocks gender affirming medical care for a child?
Navigating that at the moment, had never seen a settlement or a court decree that explicitly said this child cannot transition or cannot access gender affirming medical care without this parent's consent or whatever. I am not going to pretend to be an expert in family law because I'm not. So I know what I don't know, and I'm working with a pro bono attorney who is an expert in family law and custody issues on navigating this particular issue. I think that there are arguments to be made that it is not in the best interest of the child, obviously. That, all the statistics that we have around lack of access to gender affirming care show that, it is abuse. It is harmful. It is really detrimental to these kids. And I think also age is a thing, like, if the kid's 16 and able to kind of self-advocate versus if the kid is 4. But I think that to the extent that we can advocate against orders like that, obviously we should be. And when those things do happen, I think, consulting with an expert, having a mental health provider who is an expert in gender dysphoria and gender affirming care, maybe provide an affidavit or something to the judge explaining why this is really harmful. Anything like that you can do to advocate, I think is very important. Unfortunately, I think we're going to see a rise in things like that, given all these states targeted bills at denying access to gender affirming care. So hopefully, not hopefully, but given the, I think, frequency of that soon, I think hopefully will have better answers and more information about kind of how to navigate that, but definitely problematic and something we should all be aware of.
I may have missed that, but did you mention which states have banned gender affirming care for children?
I don't have the list in front of me. I can make sure that's in the PowerPoint before I send it. Not many actually passed, but many were introduced, including in Florida. And the folks who I work with that are, in it in Tallahassee with the legislature believe that it will be reintroduced next session. And that would be really harmful, in part because, these bills, it's not only banning kids from gender affirming care. In some instances, it's criminalizing the doctors. There's already so few, as I discussed earlier, medical providers that are providing gender affirming care. And so the very few pediatric endocrinologists, that are providing this type of care, to subject them to criminal, and then in some places they're trying to, remove children from their parents, basically, for parents providing gender affirming care and being affirming, which, again, we already have a crisis where so many kids aren't supported and affirmed at home. So it's just such unnecessary, devastating legislation.
Just the stuff that's been going on statewide and nationally really makes me wonder, but it was good to hear you say that for most people, it's just the fact that they have never run across this issue and they just need education.
Right.
So there's not malice, but there's definitely malice on the national.
There's a lot of malice. I think the people introducing, these bills aren't being crafted by legislators who are like, my constituents keep calling and saying trans kids shouldn't have medical care. No, it is like all these studies and surveys have showed that in almost every state, trans youth issues is at the bottom of most people's priority list. We're surviving a pandemic. People are unemployed. People are struggling to get food. And, more time was spent in Florida debating the trans sports bill than COVID recovery. And so what I'm saying is these legislators aren't crafting these bills in response to problems or in response to their constituents. It's these organizations like the Heritage Foundation and ADF that are pushing this legislation, which you can tell because our bill here was almost identical to the Idaho bill, which is almost identical to, there's malice coming from certain places, but I think the majority of like our teachers, our principals, our social workers, our caseworkers, they want to be doing the right thing for these kids, and they just need some assistance learning how.
I'll include a link in the follow-up email to a podcast that I was listening to about a doctor who provides this kind of care for children in several states, especially states where there are not a lot of resources.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it was
Cool.
really interesting. You know, kids travel hours to get to this care, and adults too.
Yes, I work at the we have a medical legal partnership with the Youth Gender Clinic at UF Health here in Gainesville. And every Friday I'm there from like 8 to 1 screening trans kids and their families for health harming legal needs. And that's where a lot of these education cases come from, and name change and stuff. However, I can't tell you how many kids get there and I'm like, you drove from where? Like, we have kids come from the Panhandle. We have a family that comes from Miami. Like, these people already have so many barriers to accessing high quality care, and it's only the ones who are not privileged enough, but like have access to transportation and parents that are willing to spend the day driving to and from for them to get this care. So it's just ridiculous.
Well, I appreciate all the work you're doing. You're like a one-woman roadshow trying to educate everybody and do these clinics, and I appreciate you spending a couple hours with us. It was a great webinar. We got lots of compliments about it already in the chat. Before I forget, the CLE number is 5300. Again, it's 5300. It has been approved for 2 general credits, and I'm still working on getting the bar to approve the bias elimination credits. So you may want to hold off if you particularly need the bias elimination credits. Just give us a couple days to get that straightened out. But I will send out a bunch of resources tomorrow along with the recording and the PowerPoint. Thank you so much, Simone, for doing this.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for attending and caring about, you know, these issues. These kids are so underrepresented, and it fills me with joy and hope to see this many people, you know, attending presentations like this and engaged in this work. So thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, guys.